Bonsoir, je vais essayer de parler, j'ai un peu perdu ma voix en allant à Paris, mais je vais essayer de la retrouver. Bienvenue à l'ambassade pour cette deuxième édition des Climate Talks. C'est un événement que nous faisons en coopération avec l'ambassade d'Allemagne. Merci pour cette coopération. Et pour le public francophone, nous avons donc décidé que la conversation aurait lieu en anglais, mais grâce à notre formidable animatrice et modératrice Céline Bach, Céline sera capable de traduire les questions que vous voudrez poser après en français, ou si vous avez besoin de comprendre les réponses de certains panélistes. So, as I was saying, welcome to this embassy for the second edition of the Climate Talks. We have decided to have on a regular basis some conversation about climate change or environment, because we think it's the real big challenge that we are all facing, and we think that it's interesting to talk about one topic and have some discussion with many people from the civil society, from institutions, from public sector, to try to find out what kind of solution we can and what we can do about those challenges. So in December we had a very interesting conversation on plastics and oceans, and today it's going to be sustainable finance. So I'm not even sure what sustainable finance means. In my mind, it would be more financing the sustainability, but maybe I'm wrong, so I will need some explanation. And it's true that I remember when we were in the middle of the negotiations of the Paris Agreement on climate. At the time, finance and climate, it was like, okay, we, the richest countries, will have to pay, to sacrifice some money to save the planet. But I think that it's not just a sacrifice, it's not just, et voilà, just let's have some money to finance climate change. I think it's much more complex, and it's going to require much more efforts. And we will discuss about that tonight, but it's really how investors will have to function in a low carbon economy, and how companies will have to prove that they are acting in a sustainable way. And we already are seeing this kind of efforts. For example, companies are rated according to their investments, and as you know, some banks have decided not to fund anymore some actions like sand oils or things like that. So France will have to prepare the summit at the next General Assembly of the UN, One Planet Summit, especially the finance part. So that's why we are very eager to listen to all your good ideas, to know if there are good initiatives from the public or the private sectors. And I will leave the floor to my German colleague. I just want to tell you that after this panel, we will have a drink downstairs. And without further ado, I want to welcome Franziska Agathon, the Deputy Head of Mission of the German Embassy. Thank you.
Bonsoir. Good evening. Je me joins à Madame l'ambassadrice pour vous remercier pour votre présence ici ce soir. Je tiens aussi à remercier Madame l'ambassadrice de nous avoir accueillis si chaleureusement ici. And I will now change to English because we've chosen this as the language of the event that we mainly communicate in. As the effects of climate change become more evident and visible, we see that increasingly corporations adapt their business models to respond to systemic risks. And governments must also grapple with the effects of climate change. But the effort required is beyond the capacity of the public sector by itself. So the financial sector really has a key role to play, and this is something we'd like to explore in detail today on challenges we identify, solutions that we can find in that particular sector. In Germany, we believe that the integration of the financial industry into our climate action efforts is key to making our country's entire economy more sustainable. That is why we are developing a sustainable finance strategy to turn Germany into a leading sustainable finance location. Sustainable finance can accelerate the development of an environment that's friendly and climate resilient in an economy. It can play an important role in meeting the objectives that we all agreed upon in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Germany stands by its own global responsibility to combat climate change. That means, amongst many other things that we do, that we as a German embassy organized our first climate talk in Ottawa in 2015. And we're very pleased to have organized many talks on key issues since then, and are delighted to partner with our colleagues from France to continue this important work. These talks bring together experts with different backgrounds so that they can share their various insights and best practices from their own countries. And tonight, I believe we really have an exceptional panel here with us, moderated by a global leader on the business impacts of global change, and with far-reaching understanding of sustainable finance, and that's Céline Bach. Thank you very much for doing this here this evening. Ms. Bach is the founder and president of Analytica Advisors. And I invite Ms. Bach, without further ado, to introduce the panelists, and please enjoy the evening.
Well, good evening, and thank you to Your Excellency Ambassador Rispal and to Chargé d'Affaires Hagedorn. Allow me to add my welcome to this Climate Talks on Sustainable Finance, a series which was originally conceived by the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany here in Canada. And our theme today is how to save the planet and make money. Alors, je vous souhaite la plus cordiale bienvenue à ce forum sur le financement durable, comment gagner de l'argent en sauvant la planète. I'd like to start with some thank yous. A sincere thanks to all of you for taking some of your time to attend this discussion. This is a sold-out event, and thank you for making it such a success. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us today, for having traveled and taking time out of your busy schedules. Thank you to the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the Clean Economy Fund, the McConnell Foundation, and the Ivy Foundations for their steadfast leadership on sustainable finance policy. And thank you finally to the wonderful teams of the German and French embassies for conceiving of and planning this actually fairly complex event. Ramin, Leonard, Yannick, Marie, Clarisse, and Thibault. We're here to discuss how to save the planet and make money. And I'd like to say that we're at the beginning of this conversation. And in that spirit, my first request of all of you is that you begin thinking now and preparing your questions for our panelists on this important opportunity. Les questions, comme a dit Madame Rispal, pourront se faire tant en français qu'en anglais. So how will we proceed today? Well, first we'll hear from our panelists. We'll each offer us 5 minutes of introductory remarks on their organization's role in answering the question, how to save the planet and make money. And we'll then have a discussion with our panelists, answering some questions that we hope you'll find very stimulating and interesting. And then finally, we look forward to an animated period of questions and answers from all of you. And at around 7:30, we will end the formal part of this event to pursue our discussions in the foyer and enjoy the warm hospitality of our hosts. So let's begin. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce your panelists for this evening. I will introduce them all and then ask you to welcome them. So from my immediate left, beginning Bertrand Millot, who's Vice-président and Chief of Investment Stewardship at la Caisse de dépôts et placement du Québec. Sabrina Schulz, who's the head of the Berlin office of KFW, the German Domestic, Promotional and International Development Bank. Tim Lane, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. Julia Langer, the CEO of the Atmosferic Fund, which is an endowed regional climate agency that invests in low-carbon solutions in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And finally, Xavier Bonnet, who's the head of the Economic Services in the Canadian Embassy of France and former head of the Economic Department of the Ministry of Ecological Transition, where he participated in guiding the first issuances of France's sovereign green bond. Please join me in welcoming them. So, I'm going to offer some brief remarks about some of the framing thoughts for this introduction. I'll start by saying that the Paris Agreement's Article 2.1c calls on capital flows to be aligned with the Paris Agreement's goals. It therefore follows that the countries that have ratified the Paris Agreement are bound by this commitment. And that's why we look forward to the recommendations of Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance, are following the work of pension funds to engage with companies around the world through the Climate Action 100+, and welcome the first comprehensive report of the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial Sector, of which the Bank of Canada is a member. I'd like us to recall that sustainable finance, for sustainable finance, our goal is dictated by the physics and the goal of net zero carbon emissions. This is because stabilizing the Earth's temperature at any level will require global emissions to fall to zero by 2050 overall, because more greenhouse gases lead to more warming, and we already have reached 1 degree Celsius of warming. The special report, 1.5 degrees Celsius, of the International Panel on Climate Change says to stop the temperature from rising more than 1.5 degrees, we will need to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and reduce emissions by 40 to 50% by 2030. So the Paris Agreement is founded on a principle of national plans, which will be communicated or updated in 2020, and for which there will be a collective review every 5 years, and the first review begins very soon in 2023. What's more, we are seeing the Paris Agreement being translated into the work of international institutions such as the World Bank, that is phasing out all lending to fossil fuels, and we're seeing this in discussions at other institutions such as the International Energy Agency on the degree to which its energy scenarios are aligned or not with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We're also seeing this here today in the diversity of the work being undertaken by all of you. We have gathered here today professionals for the Bank of Canada from 11 different federal departments, crown corporations, NGOs, 25 countries, and people from all walks of life. And all of this tells us that establishing how to save the planet and make money is all of our work. So with that, Julia, will you kick us off with a round of 5-minute introductory remarks on what your organization does in relation to how to save the planet and make money?
Thank you. Great to be here. And I guess I'll give you a quick introduction of my organization because we're not as well known as the Bank of Canada. And basically, the City of Toronto, 28 years ago, before climate change was headline news, said, okay, this is a big global problem, but what are we going to do about it at home? And set up an endowment, originally endowed with $23 million, to advance local solutions to climate change and the air pollution. And then we've received an endowment from the province of Ontario as well. And then we are working right now to receive a federal endowment, showing that all levels of government actually have a strong interest in advancing solutions, and that they have to and can happen locally, sort of from the bottom up and from the top down. So we're happy to be a part of that. And when we look at how we can actually advance these solutions, there's no magic bullet. In fact, it's, as somebody famously said, magic buckshot. And in Toronto, we have a plan called Transform TO. It has 36 actions which can reduce carbon, but also it contribute to better health, better mobility because we're stuck in traffic all the time, create jobs, and many other benefits. And so that, I think, is the framing for sustainable finance. It's sustainability writ large. It's not about, just one outcome, which is a financial ROI, and we're talking about greenhouse gas emission reduction. But we can't really actually advance these solutions without getting other benefits out of this, because people have many objectives. And so I think we have to think about sustainability writ large. And we think about it very much at the ground level in cities. And what does that mean? That means emissions are coming from buildings, from transportation, and from waste. And so if you understand the sources intimately, then you can imagine solutions practically. And that means that we're, think about it, our buildings. This is part of our most important infrastructure, and we're wasting a huge amount of energy, and energy waste is money waste. And if there's money waste, then if you actually can put together transactions to save that energy, there's an ROI. And there's also a benefit for the people who live in those buildings and who own and operate those buildings. The same can be said for in the transportation space in the waste area. And so what's stopping this? In the energy efficiency side of things, this is the biggest, the fastest, and the cheapest opportunity for achieving the emissions, the scale of emissions that we need to address, as Celine mapped out, our emission reduction targets. But why is it not happening? Across Canada, we have a $250 billion investable opportunity, and it's not just cheap, it pays. There's an ROI on that. But there's barriers, and so it wasn't that anybody was evil and put them in place. They exist. We have to actually recognize that from a sustainable finance perspective and put our financial innovation into play to actually get at those investable opportunities. There's barriers like risk perception. People don't understand energy efficiency, and so they consider it risky. There aren't specialized underwriting tools which value OPEX savings, where we like new revenue, but we don't value savings when we're underwriting financial transactions. There's split incentives. This is tragic but true, and we just need to address them in an innovative way and in an aggressive way to get at these practical, sustainable finance opportunities. This is the kind of work that TAF has been doing with our own endowment. So looking at where are the barriers in Toronto, for instance. They're building lots of condominiums. They were building them very, very inefficiently. We worked with developers like Tridel to come up with a financial structure that would allow them to build way better than building code. No lack of technology. We have so much technology. It's just not deployed at scale. And sometimes the challenges are really about the financing structures. So if you can actually sit back and say, I want to do that deal, the bankers need to get in the game and really make that opportunity happen. So I can go on and on about the kinds of investments that we've made to demonstrate de-risk and make things investable, but we can maybe get into that in questions. Thanks.
So good evening. That's a challenge, 5 minutes for telling you something about the efforts of KFW, the Federal Republic of Germany, and the European Union in the area of sustainable finance. So I'll try to be quick, but perhaps a few words about KFW to start out with. If you haven't heard of KFW yet, you can imagine it to be a bit like a mix of EDC, BDC, and DFI in Canada. KFW was set up in 1948 after World War II to reconstruct Germany, which is also why the W is in the name of the bank, Wiederaufbau, reconstruction. And I guess that's exactly the challenge we are up against. We have to reconstruct our economy, not only to be compliant with the Paris Climate Agreement, but also with the SDGs. Now, being a government bank, I guess we also have to be something like the front runner in Germany to demonstrate to the retail banks that sustainable finance is something that can actually be done, that can be implemented, but we're experimenting a lot. So sustainability is kind of part of the DNA of KFW, so we are taking it seriously, but there's no blueprint. So we have to create a blueprint at this point in time. There are simple things we do. So, for instance, we are a supporter of the TCFD, but kind of who isn't nowadays? Climate risk is something that every single bank has to take on board these days. But how do you meaningfully align a bank with the Paris Agreement or the SDGs? So we're currently testing a range of options. We are checking whether we should create an annual CO2 budget for the entire bank. What will we do if it's used up in July? I have no idea. We might introduce a CO2 shadow price, which is an interesting option because we're also discussing CO2 pricing in the European Union at this point in time. We will check the Paris compatibility of our clients. We might decide to only work with countries, that's the development side of the bank, only work with countries that have ambitious NDCs. We might want to apply or in fact the EU's taxonomy, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit, and a taxonomy of technologies of eligible projects for financing, or we might apply a combination of all these options. So by 2020, we want to have a sustainable finance roadmap that's going to be on the internet, and hopefully lots of you in Canada will also challenge us on it, and we can do some mutual learning. What's important to mention as well is that just recently the board of KFW has come up with an exclusion list. So things that we are not going to finance anymore. And most importantly, we officially stopped coal financing. Now many other banks have stopped financing coal already a few months or years ago. And this is actually the reason why you won't see a big announcement on the internet, because our CEO is so embarrassed that we have come to this decision so late in the game. And in fact, it's been about 5 years that KFW hasn't financed any coal projects anymore. But, and this is not something you should quote, the economics ministry asked us whether, if there is now an interesting offer, like something we could make money with and it contains coal, if you might still want to consider that. So should we not build in any loopholes into the exclusion list? So we said no, and the economics ministry was not happy in the least. Another thing we're trying to do is we want to apply an SDG mapping to all our projects. So we want to make it entirely transparent which SDGs, which sustainable development goals, any particular project domestically and internationally actually applies to, just to make it more transparent and to actually demonstrate there's something good in sustainable finance as well. It's not just about risk. And of course, KFW is not doing this because it's a good idea, but because there's a whole debate going on in Europe at the moment on making sustainable finance a reality. I mean, it's not only necessary in order to abstractly align our economies with Paris. This is also about additional investment needs every single year of between 180 billion euros and 270 billion euros. So an extra 180 to 270 billion euros per year to make the European economy Paris compatible. You might see this as a burden, in particular for taxpayers, but obviously the big hope is that the private sector will come in, and so banks will have to play a major role in this as well. We're also debating in the EU how can we make sure that financial institutions integrate the exposure to ESG risk in a much more sophisticated way in their risk management. And then there are also some legislative proposals being discussed about strengthening transparency and long-term thinking 2 of these debates are finalized already, and you can ask me later what this entails, but just so you've heard the buzzwords already, the EU has come up with a regulation on disclosure. It's very simple. It stipulates that institutional investors have to disclose their exposure to ESG risks in the future. And then there's going to be a regulation from the fall of this year onwards on benchmarks. Essentially, as you will know, there are various low carbon indices floating around. And in order to make any sense of all these different labels, the EU wants to create benchmarks so they become comparable in the end. Another project is about a taxonomy, and I'll explain this very briefly. This is about a set of definitions of what actually might count as green or as sustainable in the future. So a group of experts is going through very many different sectors like water, energy, buildings, waste removal, and so on, to say what is actually a sustainable project to invest in. There are lots of challenges around this because what counts as green today will be dark brown in 5 years' time. So things like how do you account for the dynamics, the dynamics in the technological development? Well, that's a challenge, and we haven't figured out in the EU how we're going to tackle this. I will probably leave it for the next round to talk about what the German government is doing. It's only just starting to talk about a sustainable finance strategy. There's not much to say about this yet, but I'll touch upon this in a minute.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Xavier Bonnet, yes. I'm at the Embassy of France, but previously, I was part of the Ministry of Environment in France, and my involvement was important together with the Treasury to define a number of things to contribute to the structuration of the financial market in France, and with the idea that it could be helpful in the global reflections. So my point today will be on 2 aspects. The first about the regulation of disclosure for financial but also for non-financial corporations. And second, I will tackle the issuance of a green sovereign bond that France did in 2017. So first of all, dealing with disclosure. There was already some pieces of work dealing with disclosure of corporations embedded in laws in the 2000s and in 2008, what we call the Grenelle, Loi Grenelle, but it was not enough, and in 2015, just before the summit, the COP21 summit, it was decided to go further with 2 objectives. First, it was to improve the quality of available information, notably for so that financial stakeholders can include these issues in their decision making. And second, it was to improve the ownership of climate and green issues for firms and financial institutions. Yes, these 2 objectives were very much at stake because the question was to enrich the information given to savers, for instance, when they decide to invest in a portfolio. They have to get some information of what is the corporation doing about climate change or green transitioning. And there is a specific provision in the law dealing with the asset management, and in particular about what the institutional investors are required to do. So they have to show what is the strategy they put in place and how they follow this strategy with indicators dealing with different kind of measures of GHG emissions. So that's the kind of things that are now also discussed at the European level, and that was already something discussed at the Bloomberg's TCFD. Mr. Bloomberg was chairing this group dealing with the disclosure for climate issues, and it's something that we think is very important to get some momentum of these issues at the global level, because in the end it is very important that these issues are discussed at the same, with an harmonized view at the global level. That's the objective that was behind this first kind of action initiative taken in France. And the second, as it was told before, there are a lot of kind of actions being at the local level, but the state has also something to do. So the fact was that it was necessary for the French state to show what she was doing for the green transition. So it was decided to issue a green bond, a sovereign bond. It's not a project bond. Of course, green bonds exist already in the market. When a corporation issue a bond, it's connected to a project, being, for instance, renewable energy, something very, very precise. For a state, of course, there is a little part of investment in the budget dealing with this kind of issues, projects. And Poland actually issued a project bond, a green project bond, before France. But France decided to do something much more encompassing every kind of actions it was doing towards the objective for greening the economy. So it's dealing about policies, how the state incentivizes decisions for firms or households. So the question was to review all the budget and see how we can qualify this kind of expenditure as a green expenditure in the budget. So there are some very easy suspects, such as the tax credits we do for refurbishing real estate. That kind of expenditures were marked very easily. So just as a conclusion, just to say that it was a success, because 7 billion were issued at the first round, and now it's all in all it's more than 15 billion which were issued since 2017. It was at the beginning in 2017.
So I work for Caisse, dépôts et placement du Québec. We are a pension fund manager, 310 billion Canadian dollars invested across the world in private equity, infrastructure, listed equities, fixed income, and real estate. So that very large investor, active internationally, and after the COP21 meeting in Paris, we decided that we should start thinking about what to do about climate change, and came up at the end of 2017 with a strategy which is articulated along 4 pillars. The first one is that we take climate into consideration in all the investment decisions, and that's very important because some companies, some investments are affected positively, there are opportunities, some are affected negatively, and having that kind of discussion helps build awareness about what climate change is about and how it affects the economy. The second one is that we committed ourselves to increasing our green investments by 80% by 2020, so from 18 to $32 billion. And that is spread among green energy, green buildings, and public transport. And obviously we invest a lot in renewable energy, but also, as some of you may be aware, we've committed ourselves and developed a 67-kilometer electric rapid transit system in Montreal, which is also obviously contributing to reducing emissions and greening the planet. So that's a very important commitment. The third one, which is equally ambitious, is to reduce the intensity of our portfolio by 25% by 2025. So as you know, under COP21, certain countries, well, most countries committed themselves to certain goals by 2025, 2030, well, we thought we'd do likewise. What is the way we've articulated this, because we decided not to be prescriptive, we decided to give budgets to the portfolio managers within which they could operate. And that preserves their independence. They make their own decisions as to where they want to invest the money, but now they have obviously return objectives, they have a risk budget, and now they have a carbon budget within which to operate. And to make sure that this had teeth, we actually linked the bonuses of everybody at the Caisse to meeting those objectives. And this is very, very important because you get people's attention when you do that. And also it positions us quite well to insist that those things are put in place in companies that we have in the portfolio. So that's the third pillar. The fourth pillar is actually to do a lot more engagement. That means interacting with companies, interacting with governments, policymakers, our peers, and pushing everybody in the right direction. And this is probably the most important pillar, because what is in our portfolio or not will unfortunately probably remains on the surface of the planet, belching carbon. What is really important is that we push companies to reduce their emissions. We push power producers to go from coal to gas, from gas to green energy, and we push just everybody else, food makers, everybody, to actually reduce their carbon emissions. And Madame l'Ambassadrice, vous avez posé la question, what is sustainable finance earlier? I'd go much broader than carbon. It's about good practices, whether it means that a food producer is procuring palm oil from sustainable plantations, or measuring its carbon, or that a mining company doesn't employ children or use unsustainable practices across the board. It's something that really needs to be part of corporate strategy, from diversity within the corporation to your supply chain, to your emissions and your stewardship of your business, and including the products that you design that should be greener. So that's integrated at the Caisse within that, carbon is integrated within that general emphasis. So we're working on that. The first year has been quite positive. In 2018, we did decrease our intensity by about 10% in the portfolio, and increase our green investments by 10 billion. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think also what we've noticed is, for institutional investors like us, carbon is complicated, it's physical, you need to measure it. It's not precise, and so there is a lot of change that needs to be done internally. There needs a lot of training that needs to be done, and once that is done, we can then put more emphasis on actually the engagement and pushing everybody to reduce their carbon.
Okay, I'd like to thank, first of all, our hosts and the organizers for convening this event. I think it's a great opportunity to talk about these issues again. And as others have stressed, international cooperation is really central to tackling these challenges. They're challenges that we're all facing. Certainly there are differences across different countries and jurisdictions, but there are also important similarities, and I think we can all learn a lot from one another. Now, at the Bank of Canada, our involvement in these issues, I think, is primarily related to our role, first of all, in assessing the developments and trends affecting the global economy and the Canadian economy, and also our role in assessing the risks affecting the Canadian financial system in particular. And if, given that climate change and also the shift to a lower carbon economy are among the most important forces affecting the world economy and financial system this century, it's natural that the Bank of Canada has a role in this area. And it's something we've been thinking about for a while now. I gave a public speech on this topic a couple of years ago. Some of our researchers have been moving ahead and working on these topics, and actually hosted a very successful research conference last Friday, which brought in researchers from academia as well as from other organizations, and really sort of highlighted the number of different angles from which these issues and their economic impact can be assessed. I think those discussions highlighted not only what we know and the wealth of different approaches that exist, but also very importantly what we don't know. It's a case for acting more aggressively to avoid the wider range of possible outcomes that we're facing. Now, to talk a little bit about what kinds of things we're doing, I mentioned the research aspect. Certainly, that's been ongoing. One element that I think we're taking into greater focus now is the impact on our financial system, and here we're looking both at the risks of climate change itself. The physical risks, for example, the risks associated with extreme weather events and wildfires and various factors like that are risks to businesses, but also to the economy, and then the risks around the transition. And even though the transition, in some sense, is going to create winners as well as losers, there are certainly many industries that are going to make money. There are others that are going to lose money to the extent that they are engaging in activities and selling products that are very carbon intensive, and those industries over time are going to generate are likely to generate losses. At the same time, from the point of view of the financial system as a whole, one could think about the risks, because the exact location of those risks is going to be uncertain as the whole process unfolds. And so, in particular, I think an important aspect of that is the fact that the data around the exposures to climate change and to the transition are highly incomplete, and disclosure is still a work in progress. And in that context, many assets that are exposed to climate change and exposed to the transition are not going to be adequately priced, because there's simply not the information available to do that pricing. And when risks are inadequately understood and mispriced, then that in itself constitutes a risk to the financial system. So this is something that we're increasingly focusing on in our analysis of financial system risks. We have our sort of a flagship document on risks to the financial system, which is our financial system review, which is appearing on Thursday on our website. And so that's kind of a bit of a watch this space. I'm not going to front run that document, but I would like to advertise it, and so that will have a more fulsome discussion of how we are currently viewing those risks. Now, another important element, of course, as I mentioned at the outset, is international collaboration. As Celine mentioned, we are now a member of the Network for Greening the Financial System, collaborating with other central banks and other organizations. We differ from some other central banks because we are not the frontline regulator of insurance companies and banks, and we're not the market regulator that can do things like imposing disclosure standards. But at the same time, we do have this broader responsibility to assess the risks and the issues that impinge on the financial system and on the Canadian economy. And in that capacity, of course, we have a lot to learn from others, but also a lot, we think, a lot to contribute. And so, we're, we've been involved in discussions in the G20, as part of their working group on green finance and then on sustainable finance. We certainly welcome the leadership of the French presidency this year in bringing these issues to the forefront in the finance track, and we've been involved in many other discussions, which we hope will only become more intense and substantive as time goes on. So with that, I think we'll leave the rest for the question and answer.
Well, thank you all very, very much for those substantial remarks. I feel like we need to just make one key term clarification, which is the TCFD. Some of you may not be familiar with that, and it stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and it is also sometimes referred to as the Bloomberg Task Force. So you heard some people mention TCFD and Bloomberg. And just very, very simply, the financial system is based on transparency of information by companies to investors and to society, and that is done via financial statements. And so the TCFD is a process that was initiated by the G20 in 2015, September, right before the meeting of COP21. And it was convened, the institutions that came together were the investors, so the users of financial information from companies, as well as what's called the data preparers, which is a pretty technical term for companies that actually have financial statements, and those that assure those financial statements. So that involves the bond rating agency, as well as accounting firms and companies that provide assurance of the quality of that information. And I'll just take it maybe one layer down, which is to say that the fundamental, a company is a device by which we allocate capital, and it gets allocated within the company itself, and it does that in a way that is related to assets. And so when we look at the results of a company and its valuation in the market, the valuation is a function of the discounted, so by risk-adjusted, discounted amount of all of the future returns, so the future the revenues less the cost of the assets that the company has. So if we think about physical risk, well, you can think about, well, how does the physical risk affect a company's assets? And if you want to think about what's referred to as transition risks, those are the risks to the business model, and so do assets become more or less valuable over time. And an easy example for that transition risk is to think about a mining company that has a mine that next to it has a major power plant that is necessary to operate the mine, but the power plant is currently operated with coal. So does that power plant being operated with coal in some way impact the value of the asset, which is the mine itself? So just an example of how those two things come together. And please, if anybody has anything else they'd like to add about the TCFD, please feel very welcome to do that. I'm going to start with a question for Sabrina to tell us about how you see the KFW's work in terms of building capital flows, both from and within Germany, that are aligned with the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, thanks for this. I mean, what's important to say really that KFW is not doing this on its own. It's really embedded in this emerging sustainable finance strategy by the German government. And I should also mention that two of our sister organizations, if I may call them that, the Federal Bank, Bundesbank, and also our financial supervisory authority, BaFin, have made sustainable finance something like a guideline for their strategy process in the next few months and years. And in fact, BaFin, the financial supervisory authority, will actually make it mandatory for all of the financial institutions in Germany to take climate into account in their operations, and BaFin will actually look at this and scrutinize whether they really are applying it or whether they're just saying that they do it. So that's definitely something that the banking sector needs to get adjusted to. And that's way beyond all the investment opportunities that you just asked about. But there's a whole kind of ecosystem of debate and of new regulations emerging, and I would hope that we can continue this debate transatlantically as well. Now, what I need to mention, I guess, is that KFW, in order to come up with any kind of new program, needs a letter by the government saying, yes, you now have the job to actually implement this program. We can't do anything by ourselves. But of course, we advise the government and we make suggestions. So we already have some ideas on how to finance low-carbon transport infrastructure. I mean, you will have all heard how the Dieselgate affected the German automotive industry and how big the challenge is to now really transform the German car sector very, very quickly. KFW will certainly play some kind of role there, because this is an instance of market failure. The market alone cannot really fix this problem, I guess. Then there's the challenge of digital infrastructure, and I guess, yeah, it's not surprising to say this with digitalization, more and more opportunities for decarbonization will emerge, but who's going to finance this? The private sector proved not to be willing to, the government proved not to be able to, so someone really has to fill this gap. And then, interesting enough, there's also the challenge of what are we going to do with our coal mining regions. You will know that Germany has committed to a phase out of coal. What's going to happen to these areas, and who will invest there? So it's certainly advantageous, I guess, for the national bank to come in and say, okay, apart from preferential interest programs, we will also we will combine preferential interest rates with grants. So hopefully KFW's activities will really contribute to demonstrating the rest of the world that the transition out of coal can be successful. So these are a few things on our agenda, but at the end of the day, it's the government that will decide on whether or not that we can do that.
Interesting. Those are, three massive challenges: the car sector, the digital infrastructure, and coal mining. Xavier, we'd really like to hear from you some of the initiatives that are showing momentum in terms of building up and coordinating new markets within the financial sector. I know there's a lot of dynamism in France right now about that.
Yeah, I was speaking of what the government, the state, was doing, but of course the private sector is key, and they are very, very much also involved in this agenda, and they gathered together in what we call, what was denominated Finance for Tomorrow, which is a committee part of the Paris Europlace Association. It's an association gathering all the financial institutions and the state. So there are insurances, banks, asset managers, institutional investors. Everybody is around the table, and what they do, of course, they speak about how they can speak in the same way, how they harmonize the way to define green and sustainable issues, because we were speaking of taxonomy, but there are many ways to speak about these issues, and there are plenty of indicators provided by the private sector, and there are also some public certification. When we speak of portfolio, in France we developed a specific label for the green and portfolios. So these initiatives gather and bring momentum to these issues, and it's all the more the case that when they talk together within this fora, gathering all the financial institutions. That's private initiative in France.
But in a sense, it's people getting to know each other as well, right? I mean, it's the institutions, but the individuals as well who are coming together and meeting, working together. Bertrand, you've one of the distinguishing qualities of some of the sustainable finance work that we've been discussing today is that it creates pull by creating markets which enable consumer choice, so in that way creates a market for sustainable finance. Obviously, education may have a role in this, and it's a theme that you brought up during your discussion of engagement with large companies as well. I'd be very interested to hear your views on that.
Yes, thank you. That, in my view, is a key question because there's a lot of pressure on finance and companies to do the right thing, but then the population is not very well educated about these issues. It is very complex, and there is, in my view, not enough information that is given to people to make choices. And you just go to any store in any developed country and you go and buy food, and you know how much sugar, flour, sodium, carbohydrates, fat there is in the food. CO2, anyone? No, it's not required in the label. So how can consumers make a choice? In Europe, as a lot of you know, when you buy real estate, there's a label that comes with the real estate that tells you the energy efficiency of the building. Well, not in North America. And so it's all these things, in my view, are critical because we live in a capitalist system. If the client wants it, companies are going to find a way to make it. But the client needs to want it, and the clients need to be given tools for he or she to know that he wants it, and that is still not clear, I think. So that's a critical, and I would call on the policymakers to think about these things, because it's not just about finance, it's about creating the opportunity at the consumer level, at the demand level in society.
This is just a quick warning. You need to be thinking about your questions that are coming up. And Julia, you at your work over all these years to create the structures that get over the barriers, that address the issues that you described a moment ago. How do you see the emergence of what we refer to as new intermediaries? But it might be helpful just even to explain what an intermediary is.
Yeah, well, I was starting to talk about some of the investment work that we do, but what we're noticing, in order to get this kind of scale that is needed, there's a bit of a missing middleman in the market, in the Canadian market, and probably in other jurisdictions as well. So, when we see energy efficiency in buildings as an opportunity, but those deals get done building by building by building. So we've been talking to the new Canada Infrastructure Bank. We think it's a fantastic model, much like KFW, and basically, how do we get public funds to stimulate private investment in low carbon opportunities? But they're looking at infrastructure as billion-dollar opportunities, and energy efficiency comes in million-dollar fragments. And so what you need is a more complete market ecosystem, so that there's people who are the project originators who can then aggregate projects and sell them to the bigger investors. Because, Caisse de dépôt, I mean, you want to invest in energy efficiency, I'm sure, but you're not going to do it you're not going to go and talk to the condo down the street in order to do it. You need somebody to package this. And so, the practicalities of sustainable finance come home to roost very quickly. You need that part of the sector. You need those companies. So we spun off a new company called Efficiency Capital Incorporated, using a financial tool that we developed. So they're now out in the market, and have aspirations to have $100 or $200 million worth of deals, so they can sell them up and then recapitalize themselves and go do the next deal. So you need to, we need everything from the central banks to the specialized banks to the commercial lenders to these small companies that are originating and doing the deals. And it's just that whole ecosystem needs to be there.
And I'll just add a word. I don't know if you know, but the largest single contributor to reducing carbon emission is energy efficiency before green energy and before getting rid of oil and gas. It is key. It's very difficult to invest in, as was mentioned, but it is absolutely key, and it's something that everybody, I mean, the entire corporate world and generally everybody needs to do to improve their facilities, their equipment, their houses, their boilers, the cars. Again, the single largest reduction of oil consumption will not come in the short term from electrifying the fleet. It will come from combustion engines that are more efficient. So it's key, and that needs to be addressed. And it's very difficult to address, unfortunately.
Xavier, would you like to comment, because this is directly tied to the sovereign bond and the policy that it enables? Energy efficiency.
Of course, in France, there are plenty of measures that are taken to incentivize behaviors to be more efficient, energy efficient. I was speaking about the tax credit for refurbishing houses. That's one example. And there are plenty of other actions like these. And what the green bond does is just not another way to finance these kind of policies, because in the end it's the same debt, it's the debt of France. But it's flagging that there is a pocket of debt which is in line with these expenditures. And again, it's a question of disclosure and transparency, how these amounts that are issued on the market are in line, coherent with a green budget. And in this green budget, yes, there are some energy efficiency measures.
So, just one point. One of the things you're raising, which is really important, and it's been raised before, is the partnership between the public and private capital. And because there are things that public funds can do, I mean, there is not enough public money in the entire planet to fix this problem. So we do have to use public funds very wisely and strategically to mobilize other capital. This is maybe an incentive that can actually get the next piece of investment, or a credit enhancement that can de-risk the capital for a commercial lender who really doesn't understand the risk, and to do it in a way that will then create a cascade, so that you can then move the public money on to the next hard nut to crack, and the next one, which is the kind of reconstruction work and new model that's having these specialized public institutions can do to stimulate the investment of private capital. And I think that's a piece of the sustainable finance equation that we really need to hold very clearly in our minds.
Sabrina, that's a perfect introduction.
Yeah, I just wanted to share some experiences from KFW's energy efficiency program. So the assets in our energy efficiency program are actually used for our green bonds nowadays, which is a major advantage. The energy efficiency program gets funded with something like 2 billion euros per year by the federal government. So we can then make preferential loans available, and there's also a grant element, as I explained earlier. So it's almost like a perfect circle, right? The trouble, though, is that the renovation rate, the retrofitting rate in Germany is at about 1% at the moment. And what we need is at least 2, if not 4%, to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So although, these are fantastic ideas and they work amazingly in theory, it doesn't really mean that market uptake is guaranteed.
Yeah, perhaps if I could make a bit more general and maybe slightly obvious point, but the financial system is not going to solve this problem of the transition by itself. I mean, if you have a system of carbon pricing that's adequate and predictable, or something equivalent to that in terms of other measures, then the financial system can play an essential role in translating those incentives into investment decisions, channeling financing where it belongs, in line with those incentives, and the financial system does an excellent job of bringing the future home to the present, and to the extent that you have disclosure which indicates where the impact of that pricing is going to be in the future, then that can be fed into those decisions. But in the absence of those other pieces, you're not. I mean, the financial system is going to be. It's going to have pretty limited capability to actually change the dial on this kind of transition.
Do you want to continue, Tim, with any comments on TCFD? I gave a little bit of a primer on it, but we would be interested in your views.
I mean, certainly that is an essential part of the puzzle, and it's partly it is because it's important for investors to to understand the risks that they're facing. I mean, part of it is that any investor, even a not particularly ethical investor, somebody who just wants to make money and doesn't want risk, should understand the impact of climate on their investments, and that's going to be helpful in both with regard to mitigation, but also with regard to, as I said, to sort of translating the incentives around carbon pricing into the decisions that are being made today. But then, in addition, it's important. I mean, for ethical investors, people who want their money to be allocated to green investments, they have to understand where those risks are, and to the extent that they're channeling their money indirectly through institutional investors, through asset managers, pension funds, etc., then it's important to sort of understand each step of that kind of that chain and how it's being affected by climate and those exposures.
Well, Tim, you just said, I'm not going to let you off the hook. You mentioned the fact that the financial system would not do that entirely of its own. Are you able to comment on any other aspects of our economy that you think will have an important role, if in addition to the financial system?
I mean, I mentioned at the outset that carbon pricing is obviously a part of that. I mean, it's obviously not in our sphere of responsibility. It's not for the Bank of Canada to advocate any particular approach there, but certainly many economists have argued that this is a situation where there is a social cost to emitting carbon, which is not adequately captured by the market prices of activities, and so you need something that could be cap and trade, it could be carbon taxation, it could be some other set of measures that somehow brings the private costs of emitting carbon closer to those social costs, which encompass the costs of climate change, and that's I think any economist's sort of standard recipe and market-friendly recipe for addressing this sort of issue.
Thank you. Well, right on schedule, literally, and this is the time when we wanted to open the floor for questions and debate with all of you. So we have 3 microphones here. I'll just raise your hand and I'll bring your mic. Don't be shy. There are no stupid questions.
Hi. Okay. So I'm Marion Chivot. I'm Sustainability Change Manager for Société Générale, based in Montreal. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Société Générale. I'm a true believer that the SDG framework is key in shifting the business models especially the SDG number 17 on partnership, and we talk about more partnership between public and private sector and whole stakeholder in general, and we have a lot of involvement in France with Finance for Tomorrow and the One Planet Summit last year, and I think we're going to have another one this year in September. Also civil society in France more recently. So my question is maybe more about the involvement of investor, and I think you partly answer my question here on how do you see the role of investors going forward, especially concerning the shift needed in the banking industry in North America. So maybe CDPQ had an answer, like the involvement that investor wants to have, because we heard a lot of direct letter from Blackwork or PIMCO last year, but nothing really happened. And I think, and I'm talking about myself, working in a bank, I think we need a lot of push like that in our organization from investor. It kind of create wake-up calls internally in our organization.
Yeah, the banks play a key role in the financial sector and ought to take this seriously. I think we invest in banks clearly and engage with them and push them to do the right thing, etc., etc. So, and this is across entire organizations. But in the end, you push. But as I said, consumers need to want it. The banks themselves need to want it. And then the question is, if you push it, they do nothing. What do you do then? Divest potentially, not necessarily the best option, especially in a small country like Canada when you don't have that many choices. But it's an interesting case. But certainly, and I think. The process of engagement, the process of very large shareholders like ourselves, engaging in public and voting in favor of resolutions to appoint X or Y at the board, or shareholder resolutions to take such and such action, is visible, and boards do listen.
Well, I think it's an ecosystem, and you talked about civil society and engagement. So, my organization, the Atmosferic Fund, is actually making investments, and we're mini securitizing. So we're selling some of these to what we call friends and family in the foundation community who don't have the same impact investing expertise and capacity we do, but who want that in their portfolios. This is small but growing. I chair an organization called Cheffe, which is really, I was talking to Bertrand about this, really helping beneficiaries and savers, talk to the pension funds about having their money invested in such a way that protects both their pensions and the planet. So you see, and then you've got, some of the leading organizations who are signing on to TCFD and actually putting out information about this. So I think, this is going to percolate through a whole range, and we also need the policy drivers of this. So the bottom-up, consumer and people whose money is being invested, but also smart policy, because we know how fast we need to do this. And so it becomes an abdication of responsibility to not have those top-down policies dealing, trying to help, the public can't rate the policies. They can only help their governments, move it along. City of Toronto just got Prudent Person Power, $5 billion in their sinking funds for their pensions, and are really looking at integrating ESG. So it starts, and those examples really need to be profiled so that we can actually, learn the lessons, fail fast, go the next round on it, because this is the planet we're talking about.
Is your question answered? Yeah, please.
Andreas Krämer, Ecologic Institute in Berlin, Germany, and it's a question really to Bank of Canada. We all seem to assume that disclosure is to investors. Behind that is the assumption that the managers of the companies know the risks, but they haven't disclosed them. Now, is that true? What is your sense? Are we setting up systems to overcome barriers in order to force the managers of companies to be honest and truthful? Or is this whole thing about disclosure also about educating the managers to force them to understand the risks that they are taking on behalf of the investors? What's your sense there?
I think it's really a combination of those things, but it's also the fact that, because companies have not had to disclose this before, they haven't even got the systems in place to even measure it, and there's a saying about, what's measured gets done, and to a certain extent, they haven't really had the responsibility. So I think they probably, in most cases, need to develop the frameworks and then implement them to be able to assess this, and then having done that, then of course managers have to be aware, and then they have to disclose it to their boards and to the investors and then to the broader public. And so I think it's really a combination of those things, and obviously one of the challenges in the absence of good information and in the absence of sort of clear frameworks and definitions for measuring this is that, of course, everybody's going to adopt the framework that makes their company look good. And that's inevitably going to be one of the consequences. And so that's why it's so important to make sure that we sort of converge on a uniform standard, so that people, so that these things are being measured in a way that actually generates meaningful information and permits the kind of comparisons that we need to be able to make.
And I would add to that, we as users of these kinds of disclosure find it very, very interesting. This is not just about their numbers, it's about the governance. Are they talking about this at the board? Are they talking about this within the management team? What is the company doing from a strategic point of view? Are they developing new products, or what are they doing with regards to climate change? And I think for companies to, I take your point that companies will always present to you whatever rosy world is best for them, but I think also in the age of Twitter and etc., they can't fool people too much. So the point is bringing them to disclose, then we can make, we as sophisticated investors, but everybody can do that, make a call as to whether we believe that story or not. And companies are very mindful these days of their reputation. All that helps to go in the right direction.
I would just like to share something that I hear from real economy representatives. And they are really scared. Because on the one hand, they are scared of tougher regulation, because eventually every single government will have to catch up on their Paris commitments. But they're also scared that at the same time they have to put all those new systems in place so they can then give all the evidence to the financial sector that's required under new sustainable finance regulation. So why am I saying this? We need to be aware that not everyone wants the sustainable finance agenda to be implemented. And we shouldn't make ourselves too vulnerable. We need to take these kinds of risks into account as well when we create new systems around sustainable finance. How are the regulations around sustainable finance compatible with regulations for the real economy? And how much kind of red tape, how much bureaucracy do governments want to impose on the real economy? I mean, at the end of the day, everyone has to be convinced that sustainable finance is good, that you can make money by investing into low carbon projects. So our whole discourse is sometimes a little bit vulnerable, so we just have to be aware of this.
Hi, is this on? Yeah, okay. So I'm interested in how disclosure can help motivate companies to clean themselves up. And I've heard two different concepts. I've heard the concept of TCFD and disclosing climate risk, and then the concept of ESG investing or ESG metrics, which I think is something different. And I'm just trying to understand how these two different types of metrics or disclosure work with each other or not, and which one is actually better suited to motivate companies to clean themselves up faster than they might otherwise?
That's a great question. The TCFD is specifically related to climate change, but ESG disclosure is very, very important, and that covers diversity, it covers supply chain management, it covers environmental footprint, which is not climate, like toxic chemicals, etc. It covers even how they take care of their customers, how they take care of their stakeholders. If you're in infrastructure, it's very important. And you think, well, all companies take care of their customers. Well, sometimes not. Sometimes they just want to put out some crappy product, excuse my French, and then make a ton of money. And then if there's no repeat customer, well, so be it. Doesn't matter. We'll do it again on some other thing. So it's really, the ESG reporting is very, very important. And there are some companies that are that do a lot of it, and some companies that don't do enough. And there are plenty of efforts to actually try to make that disclosure more homogeneous and better. There are some initiatives in Europe, there's some initiatives in North America. It all goes in the same direction to provide investors with data that they can make investment decisions with. But just to tell you how important we take these things, our equities team has developed a tool to measure the culture within the senior management and the board of a company. Because you think, how do you put your finger on that? Well, a well-functioning board, a board where there is debate, a board that is well-balanced with different expertise, different diversity, whether it's gender, color, background, whatever. All that works better, and you end up with a company that's better managed on all the other fronts as well. And so that's ESG, and that's key to sustainable investing.
Can you just explain what an ESG report is? There are people in the room who might not.
Well, ESG report is a report that explains how the company takes care about all these factors. So, and they go into it depending on their sector. If you're a producer of food, you're going to cover your supply chain, whether or not you're using products that where children are working, whether they're farmed sustainably, and it's your use of water, the whole thing. And some companies, actually, I was reading one the other day, 170 pages of it, and they go into detail. It's not just, painting the whole thing green. It wasn't. It's a number of areas where they say we need to improve, and these are targets. And the question of TCFD also imposes targets and metrics, key, because for a company that says, well, I'm not good enough, I'm going to improve, and those are my targets, and hopefully if that performance is linked to bonuses of the senior management, it's even better. And we're starting to see this. Things are evolving, and we're starting to see that, so that's good.
I guess I would just add another layer to that, and maybe Bertrand, you're hiding your light under a barrel, because data is one thing, and so having these reports, looking at carbon, looking at other ESG factors, that drive for information is kind of, was kind of a bit of a stealth strategy, brilliant strategy from this, this task force to get people thinking about it in, at the company level, at the investor level. But action is better. Your targets for actually investing are really where we need to go using that information. And so, I think there's a bit of a spin cycle happening right now where everybody's all about disclosure and reporting. Well, no, investing and reducing your carbon your exposure to the low carbon opportunities, reducing your exposure to, climate risk, and actually moving the money, shifting the money is really where we need to be going with that information.
But I would say there's also and I'll give you a real life example. It's a proxy season, which means that we as shareholders get to vote on company resolutions right now. And I was just discussing no later than this morning with a colleague, a company where shareholders saying, well, look, you need to do better on plastics. It's a company that owns restaurants and all sorts of things. You need to do better on plastics. You need to do better on your supply chain, because guess what? All your competitors are doing it. And those I can't tell you the names, but there are names that you would recognize instantly. And the fact that there's 2 or 3 very large companies, the holding companies, 2 of them are doing a much better job than the third one. Guess what? The shareholders are saying, clean up your act. So there is that peer pressure that helps. And the minute you start that pump, it helps.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one or 2 questions. So I see 2 hands. Please come forward. Yes? Thank you. That's wonderful.
Thanks very much for this very insightful discussion. So my question is actually something that you guys have all touched upon, which is related to kind of bond pricing and how can we make money with respect to forecast and so on. One of the challenges that's in place today is related to the fact that we don't have enough data on actual extreme events. And in fact, there was a report that BlackRock released last month, I think it was, or the month before, saying that to a large extent, bond prices have been mispriced because there's a lot of data that's missing, and it's not very possible for financial investors to be able to take that into account until this data becomes available. So to one extent, we just don't have the data at the moment because these events haven't really happened, and they've only been very recent. But to another extent, there are some, environmental institutions and so on. They do have some of this data available, but it's very, very difficult to get a hold of. And so that's my question. And I should probably disclose that I'm from the Bank of Canada, so this is why I have this incentive.
I was about to say, Tim will have something to tell about you, about that, but maybe I can say a word. Yes, it's a very, very interesting and tricky question. And of course, it's a question that the Bank of Canada and other central banks have to cope with when assessing the risk embedded in the bank portfolio risk. And so I will address the question with a very tiny angle, just to let you know that when we issued the green 080, it was a success also because the price was the same as the plain vanilla bond, because we could expect that if investors are putting a price on the risk, we could even have had a price a little higher, because that would be great. But on the other hand, it was the first issuance of this kind of product, and the liquidity of this product was not quite obvious for investors. And actually, the uncertainty we had as the state issuer, it was that the price would be lower than the usual bond. That would be a complete mess. It was okay. It was not the case. And now we are watching the second market and how the interest rates and the prices are differentiating with the same maturity. And I think we have good news. We are not experiencing a lower price on these bonds. And in the end, it means that the investors are giving some price to this kind of product, meaning that the risk they anticipate is lower investing in this kind of products. So again, we'll have to get some information about these products, about the risk embedded in these products. It will take time, probably. It will take some academic studies to assess the impact, actually, of the climate and environmental risk on financial assets. But it will take time, yes, we agree.
Yeah, I think I mean, there is not enough data today to be precise on, pricing things. I agree with that. I'm not sure climate science will ever be, since it's a whole bunch of statistics going forward, ever be sufficiently developed to be able to give the kind of detailed data that we're used to in finance, but that's a different matter. But I would say also you have to look at this, the way we do it at the Caisse is look at it largely on a qualitative basis, and because you can't really put a price on it. But if you look at the world, or you look at a company or a financial product with eyes sufficiently wide open, thinking, okay, well, how could the climate be affecting this? Is my company going to be, is it based in one location and some hurricanes, some floods is going to affect it, therefore it's more vulnerable? Is it depending on some supply chain that's particularly at risk? Is it subject to transition regulation because of its business model? Or is its product going to become out of fashion because we're going to electric cars or whatever? You look at it this way, and the trick in the finance industry today is cultural, because in the past, financial analysts, and that's the way people are trained, etc., and you look at sensitivity analysis plus or minus 2%, and is it going to be good in those scenarios? It's plus or minus 2%. Today, in some cases, it's not plus or minus 2%, it's 0 minus 25. And the question is, do you lose your shirt if it's minus 25 or not? Are you prepared to take the bet? Are you paid enough to take that bet? But you need to have your eyes sufficiently wide open to be able to look at it this way. It's very unusual because you're looking at black swans or whatever you want to call it, that could happen either because of the weather or because of some regulation. And you just need to be aware, think about it, think, yes, I've got some vulnerabilities here. Am I prepared to put the money or not? And that analysis today, if you do it properly, gets you half or 3/4 of the way there. Especially, depending on your time horizon, because if you invest over the 5-10 years, climate risks over that period is difficult to measure. It's over the very long term that it's important.
Yeah, I would just cite one resource that you might find interesting, which is the Munich Re's, I think it's called the NatCat service, so natural catastrophe service. I think it's also helpful to bear in mind the annual insured and uninsured loss due to climate change, which is trending upwards, and there have been some discussion of it reaching $1 trillion. And when that happens, I'm pretty sure that the bond rating agencies are going to decide that they need to take into consideration some other data which they're not considering today. We're at last year we were at $350 billion in half insured, half uninsured. If it triples, I think the pricing will kick in. We had one other person with his hand up. Have you gone away? Are you still there? Okay, so we're gonna take maybe 2 or 3 questions in a shotgun way.
Maybe just another resource would be the United Nations on trade and development. OTAD has an investment arm, and sustainable and green stock markets are also part of what they've been promoting. They have a strong environment, social, and governance. That's the ESG promotion and monitoring of what's happening.
Thank you. That's terrific. Is this the last question? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So tell us. Thank you.
Hi, Bo Fredbeck. I work for the Environment Commissioner out of the Office of the Auditor General. I had a question about the instruments you've proposed in trying to accelerate the integration of externalities into investors, and do you think this will be able to bring them into account sufficiently in time? And I think we're running out of time to think that investors, especially the private sector, is going to have a different lens, and we might need to think of a lot more aggressive ways of making sure those externalities are brought in. Particularly looking at ecosystem collapse. So you probably heard of the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystems. It came out just last week in Paris, and it's saying that we don't have a lot of time, and we need something very catalytic in the finance world. And I've seen great discussion forums, but we're going to have to get a lot more aggressive than think that the private sector is going to step in and solve the problem.
I would say again, the finance world can help, but the companies that are producing stuff are the ones that are affecting the planet. And again, a company that we decide to sell and is not in our portfolio is going to continue existing doing that. There needs to be policy. There needs to be a price of carbon. There needs to be all sorts of things that are put in place, whether it's, just a simple example. Electricity executives are remunerated. Their bonuses are linked to, in some cases, to increasing sales. Well, how about reducing sales? How about linking the bonuses of electricity companies in making sure they put in energy efficient policies so that their sales reduce? That type of thing will change, but the finance system can help. It's not going to solve that problem. And again, my point earlier, education, the public needs to want it. And the public needs to be given ways to make the decisions as to what they buy, what they consume, and how they consume it. So it's an ecosystem, but let's not forget the demand side of it.
I can only wholeheartedly second that, but maybe just underline it by saying we need bold political decisions, and we need the political class that's not afraid of actually speaking out the truth, which is that we need to price carbon and that we need harsher regulation and that the real economy has to change. I guess we need to talk about political change in the first place, and everything else will fall into place, I would hope.
So the question about externalities, obviously carbon pricing, but there are other policies to try to get at some of the water efficiency and water degradation. There are definitely tools. We know it's just like there's no lack of technology. There are no lack of policy tools and tools for doing that. And we're just not using them. It's kind of, how everybody talks about technology and technology deployment and commercialization. We haven't commercialized, we don't think about commercializing some of the policies, some of the financial instruments that we know about and that we use in other contexts. I'm a big fan of credit enhancements and loan guarantees to try to move private capital into opportunities that they don't see or that they might consider risky. These are some of the things. We have to stop thinking about commercialization just for zippity-doo-dah technology and apply it to a whole bunch of other tools that we have at our disposal. We can get to scale and then get some of that momentum.
All right, well, on that note, I think it's an invitation to enjoy some time together. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here tonight. This is not a light and joyous subject. You stood through the whole process. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rispa, for your welcome, and to all a very pleasant post-seminar discussion downstairs.